Salutations. This is Chad with Essays on Trust, where we talk about trust in society. Today we're focusing on building on our series on news organizations. We're exploring just how trustworthy some of the news organizations who claim to be not biased actually are. We're exploring whether they actually are fair-handed in their treatment of issues and politicians in their coverage. We're looking to see if they're pushing an agenda and being compromised by activism. We started with exposing ABC's pro-abortion coverage last month, and today we're moving on to look at the Washington Post. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how the Washington Post covers presidential wrongdoing or corruption. We're going to be comparing their coverage of the Trump-Russia collusion hoax and accusations of corruption against Joe Biden stemming from his son Hunter's influence peddling. So let's get started with the Russia collusion hoax. As we know from the Durham report, the Russia collusion conspiracy was invented by Clinton operatives who wanted to draw attention away from the fact she was illegally using private email servers while she was the Secretary of State. They did this by paying $1 million to Fusion GPS, who approached a retired British spy, Christopher Steele, to create a dossier suggesting Trump was colluding with Russia. The Steele Dossier was then used by the FBI in a FISA court to get a warrant to spy on then-candidate Trump in what was named Crossfire Hurricane. The Washington Post during this time dutifully promoted the Russia collusion hoax. They actually promoted the hoax so well and crafted the left-wing fantasy narrative so artfully that they won a Pulitzer Prize and bragged that they set the stage for the creation of the Mueller Special Counsel. The Mueller Special Counsel was the special counsel created to investigate the Russia collusion hoax, which found no wrongdoing on the part of Trump and wasted more than $30 million, for those who didn't know. But even after the Mueller Special Counsel found nothing to suggest the Russia collusion hoax, and the Durham Special Counsel released their report, which documented how the collusion hoax came to be, the Washington Post continued to push the collusion narrative. They knew it was all made up, and they still, as of 2023, are spinning the story they weren't wrong because Orange Man bad and Russia scary. They still have journalists denying key takeaways from the Durham report. Philip Bump, to be exact, denies that Obama was briefed about the scheme in July of 2016 by John Brennan. Bump also dismisses Trump's claim the FBI was spying on him, which we know to be true. The promotions of false accusations against Trump and his administration don't stop with the Clinton, WaPo, New York Times Russia collusion hoax. WaPo also pushed the lie that in June of 2020, Attorney General William Barr cleared Lafayette Park so Trump could have a photo op, which is a lie. And Bump also lied about Barr and the use of tear gas by federal agents during that time. These are unredacted lies, which Washington Post still stands behind Philip Bump. The Washington Post saw Trump collusion with Russia and Trump corruption in places where it didn't exist. They behaved and still behave more like the opposing political campaign staff for Democrats than they do like an impartial outlet that wants to educate their audience. They made accusations against the president that were false and ignored evidence that undermined their accusations. They made outright false claims and then doubled down on their accusations whenever the facts contradicted their narrative. The best that they finally did was to admit some of their factual inaccuracies in regard to President Trump. But even then, they still attempt to spin the story in a way that shows they didn't learn any lesson about keeping their partisanship in check. There is yet to be an admission of gross failure and no demonstration of self-awareness in their coverage of Trump. This stands in stark contrast to their coverage of President Biden. In their coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop and all of the questions about corruption that followed, the Washington Post's first response to hearing about the laptop was to spin around the Shokin firing. The story of the Shokin firing had already been in the news at that point, and they didn't take seriously how the new relevant emails impacted what they already believed and promoted about Hunter and Joe Biden's relationship with Burisma. One of the emails the Post had access to in 2020 was from a Burisma businessman, Pozarski, who wrote to Hunter, "Thank you for introducing me to your father." How did the Post respond? They asked the Biden team if Biden had met with Pozarski. The Biden's team said, "No, never heard of this guy. We don't think he even exists." And so the Post dusts off their hands and says, "Okay, thank you. Journalism done." And then they sum up their coverage in 2020 with, "It could be Russian disinformation." They dug no deeper into this trove of emails. What did they ignore in 2020? Well, they ignored in 2020 another email from Pozarski where he asked Hunter if Hunter can use his connections to help out Burisma. They ignore emails where Hunter says that Joe Biden is going to be getting 10% of a business deal that Hunter had with a Chinese company. Ignore the email that Hunter wrote to a Chinese businessman stating, "I am sitting here with my father, and we would like to understand why the commitment has not been fulfilled," i.e., in reference to where is our $5 million. In fact, in 2020, I could find no connections or no coverage of the Chinese connections that are also found in Hunter Biden's emails. Their effort in 2020 was just enough so that they could claim they didn't totally ignore it. Then in 2022, the Washington Post revisited the Hunter Biden files. And why did they ignore it for 2 years? Why in 2022 did they look again? Well, because 2022 was an election year, and they knew Republicans were going to be diving into it. And if Republicans won the investigations, would be high profile and very public, which is what's happened since the Republicans took the House back. So they had to do some defensive coverage again in 2022. Notice, complete radio silence throughout all of 2021. They started their coverage back up again in 2022 so they could get ahead of it and help shape the narrative. And so you have the rather ironic situation where politicians are indirectly holding the media accountable to the pursuit of truth. Anyways, in 2022, they revisited the Ukrainian connections, and though their effort was not substantially better, they again asked the Biden team if he had met Pozarski, and this time the Biden team gets a little self-righteous. "We already told you no." And so once again, the Washington Post says, "Oh, okay, moving on," and does no further investigation. And they also, again, don't even mention the email to the readers where the guy writes Hunter, "Hey, can you use your influence to help us get out of this problem?" The only improvement in 2022 was that they finally got around to mentioning to the readers a Chinese connection. At that time, they mentioned Hunter was involved with ECFC, but they bury the information which implies Joe Biden's involvement into the middle of the article. And what did they graze over? They grazed over the fact that Hunter represented to his Chinese partners that his father was a part of their business arrangement. There was no follow-up on that. There is no record of them asking questions of Joe Biden about that. They didn't ask Hunter Biden about that. They didn't ask him why would he say his father was a part of this arrangement. Why did he request keys to the office for his father? It seems that the Post didn't want to investigate lest they aggravate the president. And of course, the Post still doesn't mention Hunter states he is setting aside 10% of the deal with the Chinese for his father. But the thing is it's not just Ukraine and China. That seems to be all the Post has ever really touched, but that's not even all of it. The Chinese and Ukrainian connections the Post has allowed the readers to be aware of are probably not even the most damning evidence. There are a lot of other facts that merit investigation, if not at least mention. For example, more than 20 LLCs have been owned by Biden family members that have had more than $20 million transferred from foreign nationals. There were 170 suspicious activity reports from banks to the IRS. An FBI source says there are at least 3 recordings of Joe Biden discussing business with Burisma while Biden was vice president. Archer said that at least 20 times Joe Biden was on speakerphone conversations with business associates between 2008 and 2016. There are 5,400 emails with pseudonyms written by Joe Biden. Hunter Biden traveled on Air Force Two to 13 different nations to conduct business. We know the Biden family received money from entities in Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Romania, and China between 2014 and 2019. All of those facts are of no interest to the Washington Post, and if they have mentioned them, they have buried them. These are facts just now becoming available to the public and gaining a little bit of awareness among the public. But keep in mind, the Washington Post has had the resources and the commission as journalists to have been investigating these things since they happened during Biden's vice presidency. Just in the past month, actually, there's been even more damning evidence that's come out. Probably some of the most substantive stuff yet. There's a video from a meet and greet in South Carolina where Joe Biden talks about how his son is a lawyer and introduces him to a guy so that they can work out a business deal. And I will place a link to that in the description. Then there is also a piece from Andrew where he goes through some documents and raises the question about why $3.1 million came from Bladen Enterprises, a business run by a corrupt Romanian businessman named Popovici, which went to Robert Walker, a Hunter Biden associate, and then was dispersed to different Bidens. What has the Washington Post response been to this avalanche of information? Have they started investigating now that we know Biden lied about talking to his son about business? Or does introducing your son to someone in order to establish business not add up to be the same thing as talking to your son about business somehow in their minds? Did they ask the president which Bidens were the beneficiaries of those transfers from the corrupt Romanian businessman and what services were provided for these payments? What is one of the most well-financed, resource-rich, and prestigious news organizations in the world doing with new information that raises questions about corruption by the most powerful man in the world? Are they practicing journalism yet? Of course not. Instead, the Washington Post has upped their defense game. September started with Philip Bump on the Noam Dworman podcast declaring that he doesn't know anything about anything related to Biden corruption, and showing that he honestly just doesn't care about Biden corruption. Not only does he demonstrate indifference to presidential wrongdoing, he actually expresses hostility and indignation that people aren't ignoring it and that people are being curious about it because he and the Washington Post have already told us that we should ignore it and just listen to them. Then Bump writes an article on 8 September which further illustrates his contempt toward people wanting to hold Biden accountable and get to the bottom of things. Quote, James Comer's spaghetti at the wall approach to Biden sometimes means that a new piece of spaghetti knocks an old one to the floor. What's he doing with this article? It's like he doesn't understand the concept of investigating. Yes, you get information and you start with a theory. Then you dig up new information, and sometimes that new information means that you are wrong about something else, but it's new information and you continue to follow the thread. This is what people who are curious about the truth are supposed to do. If it was a story that Bump wanted to get to the bottom of, he would understand this. But his article, his tweet, is not about the truth. It's written to mock and discourage other people from inquiring. Bump accomplished his hat trick of journalistic malpractice in September by wrapping up the month with this beauty of a tweet after we found out Biden's address was the beneficiary address on a money wire. Quote, "A wire was not sent to Joe Biden's home address because that is not how bank wires work." End quote. Instead of asking questions like why was Joe Biden's residence the beneficiary address for a Chinese investment firm, Bump deflects. He acts as though a beneficiary address on a wire is a completely random address one pulls out of a phone book whenever wiring money. He doesn't focus in on the fact that Hunter was allegedly living in California in 2019 when this wire was sent. He's just defensive of the president. He shows no curiosity. He doesn't want to know why did Hunter give this address to the Chinese company. And it's also worth noting that this happened right after Biden announced his candidacy. What is the significance of this timing? Was it a backdoor campaign contribution? Anyone who wants to get to the truth of Biden corruption is going to have to go through Philip Bump. You have never met anyone who put forth this much effort to resist the forces of curiosity. And at the Washington Post, it's not just Bump, though he is the most transparent partisan over there. Here's an article from the 8th of September, also by Dana Milbank, which says, "Biden eats ice cream and pets dogs, totally unfit to serve." This is an attempted satirical take which dismisses all substantive concerns and dismisses all inquiry into Biden's behavior as nothing more than partisanship. And it also suggests that the worst thing Biden has done is eating ice cream. The slogan at the Washington Post is "Democracy dies in darkness." Really, their slogan should be "We make democracy a moot point by keeping everyone in darkness," because that's what they're doing. They're hiding things. They are keeping their readers in darkness. They cultivate low information voters so they can manipulate them to vote the way they want and effectively make democracy meaningless because people don't have the truth. They don't want to know the truth, and they want to undermine those who are looking for it. You can see it in how they have suppressed the Hunter Biden story when it first came out, and how they are actively obfuscating facts now and opposing those who are seeking the truth. The situation has left me wondering, at what point would they, the Washington Post, start reporting? What is the hard evidence that's going to satisfy them? What if we had an email from Joe Biden that said, "Hey, you've got to give my son $1 million, otherwise I'm going to withhold aid"? Would that be sufficient evidence for the Washington Post? We now have a video of him introducing his son to someone he just met in order for them to do business. And so now the goal has ostensibly been moved, the goalpost. Because surely they're going to excuse that. And I'm guessing they're going to excuse it on the grounds he was an American citizen. But what happens next? We'll find conclusive evidence that he peddled influence with foreigners. And then they'll say, well, you can't impeach him because extortion and influence peddling is not a high crime. And then we'll find out he sold government secrets. And they'll say, yeah, but he didn't sell government secrets to foreign governments. Then it's, yeah, he sold government secrets to foreign governments, but we weren't at war with that foreign government. There is no integrity over at the Washington Post. They're going to keep moving the goalpost. Are those things going to happen? I really doubt we're going to find all of that dirt on Joe Biden. But my point is that imagine if we did. Do you think at some point the Washington Post would ever actually start acting like journalists and stop defending him? There is one possibility that they will. I wouldn't say never. And that possibility is if they have a different candidate that they want to support lined up. That is the only possibility that they will pivot. What we have from the Washington Post here is a history of selective, sloppy journalism. If they want to attack, as they did in the case of Trump, they don't let the facts hold them back. And when they want to protect, as they do in the case of Biden, they don't let the facts or moral principles or principles of any sort interfere with their mission to protect their guy, their party, their agenda. At this point, even if the Washington Post was to pivot, I would not be satisfied, because it would probably just be because they had another candidate that they liked. The only way they could kind of win back some trust is if they started really acting like journalists and investigating Joe Biden and corruption, and this is a huge and Joe Biden ended up being the candidate for the Democratic Party. And if the whole time throughout the campaign and up until Election Day, they continued to seek the truth. And they stopped playing defense for Biden. That is the only way they could start to earn a little bit of trust back. So, what's the verdict today? The Washington Post, they're postmodern journalists. The truth at the Washington Post is what their friends let them get away with. And their friends, the Democrats, will of course let them get away with lying about Republicans and covering up the crimes of Democrats. So my recommendation to you is do not read the Washington Post. Do not support them. If you subscribe, cancel your subscription. If you have friends who support the Washington Post, attempt to rescue them from the darkness and bring them into the light. Help them to not be and remain a low information voter. Ask them, ask your friend, what are their thoughts on Biden clearly introducing his son to that businessman in South Carolina so that they could establish a business relationship? How is it that they think Hunter Biden could have ridden on Air Force Two to over a dozen countries to conduct business with his father, yet they never discussed business during those long flights? How could Biden write a recommendation for Lee, a Chinese businessman that Hunter did business with, a recommendation letter for her to Georgetown University, if he didn't even know the father? Who is the big guy who is repeatedly referred to in Hunter's emails? When Hunter told his daughter he had to give half of his salary to his father, was he just high and spouting off, or was there something to that? And honestly, there is so much more evidence that warrants further investigation. You're better off just picking half a dozen threads to pull on, a few questions to have ready to help your low information Washington Post reading friends. There's so much potential evidence of corruption that you don't have time as a layman to research all of it. So just pick a few specific incidents upon which you can elaborate to ask your left-wing media-blinded friends in order to help them start seeing the light. And that's my recommendation for you. We got to let people know the consequences of trusting the Washington Post and other left-wing media is that you're going to know things that aren't true, and you'll be ignorant of important things that are true. And I think that's all I got today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Probably be back in about a month or so. And at that point, we'll be scrutinizing, more than likely we'll be scrutinizing another allegedly trustworthy news outlet. Who knows? I might mix it up, but that's the plan right now. Until then, this is Chad. Be vigilant. Don't feed your mind garbage like the Washington Post.